You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. My co-host and guest today, and I think that's a first, is Bob Trapani Jr., Executive Director of the American Lighthouse Foundation. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. How's the holiday season going for you so far, Bob?
It's going well. Not done shopping yet, but it's coming along. And I know the clock is ticking, so we'll be under the gun.
Yeah, good luck with that. People I think are going to be hearing this. This episode is going to be posted on December 31st, New Year's Eve, but we're actually speaking on December 11th, just so people know if they're hearing you on December 31st and thinking, wow, we better get his shopping started.
Time travel.
Yeah, right. So thank you so much for doing this, Bob. I really appreciate it. You've, of course, been on the podcast several times in the past. You've co-hosted, you've been a guest, all kinds, and you've helped with some of the interviews. I don't know how many times you've been involved with it, but quite a bit. And any regular listeners know that, they might remember that in addition to being the executive director of the American Lighthouse Foundation, you're also a lighthouse technician for the Coast Guard Auxiliary. And I have known you we've known each other for, I think, more than 20 years now. And I know very well that you are an aficionado of aids to navigation of all kinds. And that would include our subject today, which is day beacons. Would you agree with that? That you're aficionado of all aids to navigation?
I would agree with that. And yeah, day beacons are one of my favorite subjects. So we're gonna talk about that today. It's gonna be a lot of fun. All these types of topics we discuss on the podcast are always fun, and I learn just as much as I can share something. I learn a lot too from them. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the fact that you do look at the broader scope of not just lighthouses, but all aids to navigation, and you have that viewpoint of actually having serviced a lot of these places as a technician with the Coast Guard Auxiliary.
Well, they all share a common thread, and then they were all established to protect and save lives. So,
right. Yeah. In a way, you could refer to day beacons as kind of unsung siblings of lighthouses. Does that sound right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, today's topic is day beacons, and I think people use different terms for these structures that we're talking about. You'll hear them referred to as day marks sometimes, but to me that's a little confusing because you've also got the day marks of lighthouses, which is basically the paint scheme that gives them their daytime appearance. And certain lighthouses, like the ones on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, have very famous day marks. Cape Hatteras having a black and white spiral barber pole type stripe. Some have red stripes, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not talking about those, but we're talking about historic day beacons, which I would differentiate from modern day beacons, which are largely kind of nondescript structures with, do you call them day boards on them that might have a number or some kind of identifying mark on them. What's the difference between these older historic day beacons? Some of them are 200 years old or more, and the modern Coast Guard day beacons.
Well, I think technology played a bit of a role in our modern day beacons, where we have the ability to establish these things a little more cost effective. I think historically, the way the lighthouse establishment at the time looked at them, they, like lighthouses, they seem to want to build some type of, quote, structure on these sites. And originally, a lot of these structures were established mainly at the entrances of harbors and rivers, versus where they were eventually the Lighthouse Service, and then later the Coast Guard extended that out to many sunken ledges and half-tide ledges. We'll get into that a little bit later. That went beyond the entrances to where ports and things of that nature were. So originally, the structures were actually, looking back, quite impressive, really, when we look at them. They're unique. We'll talk about some of the ones that exist today that harken back to another time. But I think it just stemmed from the fact that the Lighthouse Service just needed to have something substantial to mark some of these original dangers.
Right. And I haven't actually said it, but just to be clear, so people know what we're talking about, a general definition of a day beacon would be an unlighted nautical sea mark. So these are things that were established to be seen during the day to aid navigation, as opposed to a lighted lighthouse or other lighted structure. And it's interesting to know that day beacons were really part of the original act of Congress on August 7th, 1789, that set up the original lighthouse establishment under the Treasury Department. The text of that act said that it was an act for the establishment and support of lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers. So by beacons, I assume they must have meant unlighted day beacons. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I interpret that the same way. And I think too, when we think about lighthouses and their importance, we think about that light and that fog signal, which is incredibly true, of course. But I think what we don't understand is a lot of maritime traffic and a lot of local fishing. A lot of it occurred during the day, and a lot of boats were back in harbor by nightfall. So day beacons, they presided, like I know here in Maine, there's a lot of ledges that they're called half tide ledges. So as that tide recedes, that ledge starts to become more and more profound until low tide, and you're just stunned by the amount of ledge that is exposed. But at high tide, that ledge may be covered only by a few feet of water, and if you're unsuspectingly coming through there, and so many vessels did, they would ground on these types of hazards, which is what made day beacons so valuable to the lighthouse establishment. And also because in some areas, it was more feasible to establish, or just more cost effective as well.
Just to set things up here, this episode of the podcast is different from usual, because usually I'm interviewing somebody, I'm asking questions and they're answering. That's not how we're doing it today. You and I are going to go kind of back and forth. I know that you've become quite knowledgeable about some of the day beacons, and especially in Maine, where you live and where the American Lighthouse Foundation is based. I have some personal experience with some of the day beacons in Massachusetts. I lived much of my life in Massachusetts and have kind of a personal relationship with some of these places. So we're going to more or less go back and forth on this, and we'll see how it works out. And so I don't know if you want to start, Bob, by saying a little bit about the earliest day beacons that we're aware of in this part of the
Sure.
country.
And I think, what do you think, Jeremy, if we start maybe by where we'll say day beacons were upgraded to lighthouses, some of those sites? Why don't we start there? Because that might make some sense to do that.
Yeah, there's at least 3 of those that come to mind off the top of my head. But
Yeah, you gave me a third one today, but we know Boone Island, before the lighthouse was established, a day beacon, a wooden day beacon, was established there in 1799, and it lasted till about 1804, when a big storm came in, and anybody who's seen Boone Island knows that that's not very high above sea level. So you can imagine waves coming in there and really wrecking any wooden structure that might be on that islet. Really is really what it is. And so when that one was destroyed, they rebuilt a day beacon there. We don't know what it looked like, but it was probably around the 50-foot mark, because they tried to make these day beacons a certain size, I think from visibility, for how far away they wanted the mariner to be able to see them. And this one was a stone, and it had a little event attached to that. You can say something about that, Jeremy.
yeah, as you said, the original, I guess the original one was wood, right? Built in 1799. Well, that's not the earliest one we know about. I do know of one earlier one that we'll mention in a moment here. But so as you said, it survived until 1804. It's destroyed in a storm. A stone beacon was then built in 1805, the summer of 1805. And according to what I found, 3 of the workers involved in erecting that 1805 tower actually drowned when their boat capsized as they were leaving the island. I just want to clarify for anybody listening. I think most of our listeners who are lighthouse buffs know about Boone Island. It's a pretty famous light station. For people who don't, it's about, depending on which point of land you're talking about, approximately 8 miles off the coast of Kittery and York, Maine, and southern Maine. And it was considered one of the most isolated light stations later when a lighthouse was built there. It was a pretty difficult place to be a keeper. Just a little pile of rocks out in the ocean there. As you said, very low lying.
So that day beacon survived till 1811, when the Congress finally built a lighthouse, the first of 3 lighthouses there.
Yep.
Am I correct on that?
That is correct. Yeah,
So,
1811, 1831, I think, second one, and
and then
1855.
1855. Yes.
Yeah.
So
And
that was
mhm,
one lighthouse that came after a day beacon. Another one was at Cape Elizabeth at Two
mhm,
Lights. In fact, the existing East Towers were built. East Tower was built upon the site of the original stone monument that was built as a day beacon for ships and marine traffic coming into Portland Harbor in 1811. And that one, Jeremy, that one's listed as a 50-foot stone, black and white pyramidal stone day beacon. I
mhm.
wonder if it sounds very much like the structure that was at is still at Little Mark Island,
I think so. I've seen drawings. I think they're kind of speculative drawings
because
showing
they
showing
also
it.
mentioned that it was black and white in color, so similar to what Little Mark Island was. So that's
Hmm.
interesting. We can't know for sure, but that's certainly because Little Mark Island was established, in 1823. So it was
Right.
a few years later. But
Yeah. And if people, some of our listeners may have heard last week's podcast episode, which is a talk with Ford Reike, owner of Halfway Rock Lighthouse in Casco Bay, who was applying for ownership of Little Mark Island, and you took part in that as well. So if people want to hear more about Little Mark Island, that'd be a good episode for them to listen to. Last week's.
before you mention the third lighthouse you're aware of with this, Jeremy, these are my thoughts on it. When I look back and I see how these sites had day beacons upgraded to lighthouses, I think I look at it as a stepping stone for the government at the time, not necessarily being able to afford the construction of all these lighthouses at one time. The day
Mm-hmm.
beacons much more affordable to establish, and then as time went by, obviously, because both Boone Island and Cape Elizabeth historically are incredibly important as aids to navigation. So I don't think that would have ever been viewed differently. I just almost looking back, it was like this was our step by step to get to those lighthouses when our lighthouse establishment was in its infancy.
Before the day beacons at Boone Island and Cape Elizabeth, as you were just talking about, there is one earlier one I know of that was later replaced by a lighthouse that would have been at Baker's Island in Salem, Massachusetts. And I believe it was 1792 that beacon was established by order of the Salem Marine Society. And if I remember right, there's the documents at the time spelled it Backon, I think, Backon. Backon on Backers Island. A Backon on Backers Island is how they stated it. Of course, in those days, spelling tended to be different in different sources for the same thing. But anyway, yeah, they built a day beacon there in 1792. I don't think we have much of a description of what it looked like. Just it was an unlighted beacon, but then the a twin light station or two light station was established there just a few years later. So I think the day beacon had a short life there.
So the reverse of that is an example of where they wanted to establish a lighthouse. Congress was asked to establish a lighthouse, but did not. Was on an island in Penobscot Bay along Muscle Ridge called Otter Island. And this one was in 1904 when the outcry came for a lighthouse, when the steamer City of Rockland wrecked nearby on Upper Gangway Ledge. And there was a lot of people and freight aboard. Fortunately, everybody was saved from that, but it was a precarious situation where the steamer was up on a ledge and very at a bad angle. So at that point, they asked Congress to establish, this is 1906, to establish a lighthouse on Otter Island. And like so many times in history for lighthouses, these requests would go in year after year after year. So this request must have went in 4 or 5 years, and there was no action. In the meantime, private citizens decided to establish a fog belt at Otter Island as they waited for Congress to act. So you have this private aid, this fog belt that was used. But in the end, Congress chose not to and established instead a spindle, a day beacon there on Otter Island in its place. So it also worked in the other way where lighthouses never were established at a site. For whatever reason, Congress didn't deem that one worthy enough for a lighthouse. And it's kind of stuck because anybody who's familiar with Muscle Ridge, which is really the protected passageway, Penobscot Bay that begins at Whitehead Island Light and ends at Owl's Head Light. It's like a 9-mile stretch. Well, Otter Island's somewhere right in the middle, and it is just fraught with all kinds of ledges and things of that nature, danger. So it was, but yet shipping traffic. Steamers loved it because it was protected, and it really shaved off a lot of their travel time too, if they had to go all the way around. So, but like anything, we know that our lighthouse service in the early years was not all that, how would I say? They didn't spend a lot of money.
Proactive or
Yeah, partly
so,
because we didn't have it.
yeah, yeah.
Well, go ahead, Jeremy. I'll let.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think a lot of people know that. People have looked at all at lighthouse history, know it was under the Treasury Department, and a certain official in the Treasury Department, Stephen Pleasanton, is kind of known as sort of the Ebenezer Scrooge of lighthouses in that era. He was in charge for how many years was it?
32. I think it was from
Yeah.
1820 to 1852.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But he was just doing what he was paid to do, which was to save money for the government. So lighthouses were, if they were built at all, they resisted building them in a lot of places, and when they were built cheaply as possible, which meant they weren't built
Right.
very well.
Yeah, and Pleasanton gets a black eye in history for that. I don't really think it was all his fault. I think you're right. I think he was doing his job. I think there were a lot of people that he returned money to the Treasury every year. I think that was commended by people. It's just that unfortunate he was more of a bureaucrat. He had really little knowledge in marine affairs, which, as the world, Europe and other places were expanding their ability to protect shipping, he resisted. So we're familiar. A lot of people are familiar with the 1843 report by I.W.P. Lewis, who was a civil engineer, and he did a lot of reports on the conditions of lighthouses from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. But he also looked at day beacons as well. And I want to have a quote. I want to read a quote from IWP in the 1843 report that says, quote, "The shores of Maine are different from any other portion of the United States in the peculiarity of conformation produced by innumerable indents and deep bays filled with immense groups of rocky islets. Fogs of uncommon density are frequent and long duration on this coast, often suspending all navigation for a week or more. The great rise of tides and consequently rapidity of currents also present difficulties to the seamen, but the greatest danger arises from the host of sunken ledges that everywhere abound in the midst of the largest bays, in the narrowest channels, or offshore at distance of some miles. The entire coast of Maine being a rock formation, the soundings are deep and irregular, the approaches are abrupt, the use of the lead little resorted to, and by no means a safe guide, as on the gradually sloping bottom of Massachusetts Bay on our southern coast. Hence the necessity of lights, beacons, and buoys of the most efficient character, as well as charts of undoubted accuracy," end quote. And I think what he was finding was similar to what he found with the lighthouses. The contractors that were being used to build these original day beacons, they did not build them well. There was politics involved. And for whatever reason, Mr. Pleasanton resisted engineering. He just did not have qualified civil engineers to construct these structures. And we know that based on not only in the lighthouses, but also going further with IWP's report, it brings up the idea of Stage Island Day Beacon, which is really marking Winter Harbor there off of Biddeford Pool at the mouth of the Saco River. Nearby is Wood Island Lighthouse, for those familiar with Wood Island Lighthouse. But the idea that these structures were not built properly in the first place, I'm going to quote IWP Lewis here and say, quote, "By adopting the square and triangular base for these structures, they are frequently demolished by floating ice grinding against the angles and dislodging the masonry. Some of the beacons are merely a cobwork of granite blocks. No preparation is made for a foundation or by leveling the site for the reception of the base course of masonry. But like the lighthouse towers, they are erected on the natural surface, uneven or not, as the case may be. It was in consequence of neglecting this essential part of the work that a contractor employed to erect the beacon at Winter Harbor, Stage Island near Saco River, lost his life, one half the base resting on the shelf of a rock, the other on gravel and sand. And when the structure was nearly completed, it fell, owing to the settlement of the base courses in the gravel, and buried the unfortunate contractor in the ruins," end quote.
Ugh.
So there was obviously some consequences too. Obviously that wasn't all the time, but there was a case by not employing the proper knowledge to construct these structures. In this case, a contractor perished.
Yeah. Just a little side thing that I think, again, anybody who's looked at lighthouse history might know this, but you just quoted from the report, 1843, very important report by the engineer I.W.P. Lewis, report to Congress about the state of the lighthouses. His uncle was Winslow Lewis, who was a contractor who built a number of early lighthouses and also provided the lighting apparatus for all the lighthouses for a while. And he's sort of seen as another villain in lighthouse history because he basically undercut everybody else with his bids, and also seemed to be friends with Stephen Pleasanton, the guy in charge. So a lot of Winslow Lewis's lighthouses were not very well built. Only a few survive. Just a little aside there. But moving along, this point, maybe I could say a little bit about one of the earliest day marks that actually still survives in New England. That would be Nix's Mate in Boston Harbor. We don't have, as far as I know, we don't have an exact date for when it was built, but it was early 1800s. It's familiar to anybody who's boated around Boston Harbor, maybe taken the sightseeing cruises around there. You can see it from points on shore, but it's best seen from a boat. It's kind of right in the middle of Boston Harbor, right in near the main shipping channel there, and it's very distinctive visually. It's a pyramidal cone type structure on this square with a square stone wall kind of platform around it, and it's on a small island. But interestingly, that island was once much bigger. The island, they say, was once about 12 acres, but all it is now is a little outcropping of sand and rock. I guess it was partly the action of the tides and the weather and everything that wore it away, but also there was slate on the island, and the slate was gathered for building materials, and that helped the island kind of wash away over the years. And there's a famous legend about Nix's Mate that predates the marker there. It's often cited to explain the name Nix's Mate. The story goes that there was a ship coming into Boston Harbor. The captain was named Nix, N-I-X, and the captain was mysteriously murdered. The first mate was arrested. He was charged with the crime. They did a quick trial, probably not much of a trial. Again, this is probably all legend anyway, but he was sentenced to be hanged. And they took him out to the island, and as they're about to hang him, he proclaimed his innocence. He said he didn't do the crime, and he said, "To prove my innocence, this island will disappear." And it virtually has disappeared. So that part is true. But the whole story about the captain named Nix and everything is probably not true. It more likely, as cited by the marine historian Edward Rowe Snow, took its name from Dutch, meaning something like the whale of the water spirits, something along those lines. So that's more likely where it came from. But it's a pretty famous legend. So the land, the island, when they decided to put a day beacon on it, the island was actually ceded or bought by the Commonwealth, by the state of Massachusetts, from Thomas Knox, who was a keeper at the time of Boston Light. So it's interesting that he was keeper from something like 1794 into the early 1800s. So he sold, or I don't know if it's actually sold, I think he just gave the island to the government. And they built the marker there in the early 1800s for $7,000, which was pretty expensive for the time. I think a lot of the early lighthouses built in that period weren't that expensive. So I don't know why it cost so much, but it was a difficult place to build. So again, they built the stone wall with a wooden day beacon in the middle, enclosed by that wall. And eventually a layer of concrete was added on top of the wooden marker there. And I'm not sure when they originally did it, but it has a very distinctive black and white day mark. Partly because of that, I think, kind of macabre legend attached to it. And also the fact that before the beacon there, apparently some pirates were buried on the island. It has kind of a macabre feel about it, and almost foreboding when you see it. Think about those those legends are, but it is a fact. It's not just a legend. It's a fact that some pirates were buried there, and at least one, William Fly, who was a very famous pirate, was gibbeted or I think it's gibbeted rather than gibbeted, which means his remains were displayed to warn away other pirates, which again is kind of macabre and kind of gruesome, but they used to do things like that. So the interesting history to the island. So the marker anyway has survived all that time. It's still there. It was in terrible condition. I actually went out there with a group to Nix's Mate. I was involved at the time. I lived in Winthrop, Mass at the time, right on Boston Harbor. And I was involved with Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands. And a group, I think it was about 30 of us, went out in like a landing craft and pulled at low tide. We were able to get the craft up on the sandbar there at Nix's Mate. We all, there were like stairs on one side of it. And we went up to the top of the stone wall. And to my surprise, I discovered that at the time, the marker was kind of tilted to one side, and it was open at the bottom on one side, and you could actually crawl under it and up inside the day beacon, which I did. I don't know if I could do it now. I was more limber then, but I was able to crawl in there, and I was surprised it was hollow inside. You could see that old wooden framework from the original wooden structure, which I found extremely interesting. But because it was tilting and it was in such bad shape, in 2001, the Coast Guard had it restored. $240,000. I'm kind of amazed. I don't know if that would happen now. The Coast Guard would put $240,000 into the restoration of an old day beacon like that. But that was done in the fall of 2001. Interestingly, the company that did that was Atlantic Mechanical Incorporated. Some people might know the two replica lighthouses in the harbor of Burlington, Vermont on Lake Champlain. The same company built those. So anyway, so it's in good shape now. And as I said, I'm sure very familiar to a lot of people traveling around Boston Harbor.
Well, you attached, there's some of these legends attached to these day beacons, which is fascinating. I think just the same, they're peculiar shapes and what they're made of. It's amazing to think that sometimes the community becomes more, if I can say this without it does. They become more attached to some of these day beacons, and they may even the lighthouses. They give them nicknames. They're just things that, depending on where they're located, they're passing more frequently than maybe a nearby lighthouse. And so you find over time that day beacons actually are very endearing to these coastal communities who really much care that they are still there. So I find that interesting looking back.
Yeah, I would say Nix's Mate is probably better known to people in that area than some of the lighthouses in the region. Long Island Headlight on Long Island of Boston Harbor is almost completely hidden by trees. So I can guarantee you there's a lot of people who've taken boats around Boston Harbor who know what Nix's Mate is, but they might not even notice Long Island Headlight House because you can barely see it. So Nix's Mate is extremely well known in that area.
Yeah, any of the day beacons that precede the 1870s, the ones that still survive, they are, I know personally, I can look at them and just go, wow, you're looking at something old. You're looking at something that was once deemed very important, even if today we don't attach the navigational importance to these day beacons as they once did. But historically, as structures, some of these old ones are very valuable as surviving examples of day beacons. I think before we move on, Jeremy, maybe it would be good for our listeners to kind of go and look very quickly at how day beacons really progressed in history. So originally, a lot of them were these granite stone structures that were built up either as, in almost like pyramidal fashion, or maybe tall columns. But eventually, day beacons actually went to what they call spindles. And when I refer to a spindle, I'm talking about really just an iron pole that would have been placed into usually either rock ledge or mud. In most cases, it was rock ledge. And then on top of that, the early day beacons, to distinguish them, they used a variety of methods that we would look at today and say almost it's archaic, but rather because today we have our day boards with numbers and colors of red and green. But back then, they used things like large, what I would call almost bird cage type of top marks. Also, on top of some day beacons, they would have established like almost what looked like a wagon wheel. And from that wagon wheel, they would have these iron pendants that would come down. And there was other means of distinguishing which day beacon you were looking at based on what they would have called its top mark and how that was different. Some had casks atop of it. It was really it's a fascinating history to look back to have the mariner be able to distinguish where they were from. No different than looking at a lighthouse and saying the light's characteristic is flashing 4 seconds or sound signal sounds every 10 seconds. Well, you needed to distinguish these day beacons as well, and their top marks and the various ways they created them were a way of distinguishing those day beacons. And then as far as what IWP Lewis was talking about in terms of, there weren't a lot of day beacons across these many ledges throughout larger bodies of water. We do see, looking back in history, it was about the 1872 to 74 time period when the Lighthouse Service started to really make a concerted effort to establish what we would now refer to as spindles on a lot more dangerous ledges that existed. And I think that coincided with, as steamer traffic to a lot of these areas continued to increase, they needed to find cost-effective ways to safeguard that, and these spindles were perfect for that kind of application. And again, when we talk about a lot of these vessels, they were transiting these waters almost exclusively by day hours. It would have, a lot of times they might have even put into harbor in the evening, depending on where they were going. It's not to say that later they weren't transiting by night, because a lot of vessels did, but many did not. And so the day beacons were really important to mark these dangers.
As you're speaking, I was thinking, we're talking about day beacons in the northeastern U.S., mostly in Maine and Massachusetts. But if anybody listening knows about similar structures, historic day beacons rather than the modern ones put up by the Coast Guard, historic day beacons in other parts of the country, like the southern East Coast or the West Coast or the Great Lakes, I really don't know of those existing in other parts of the country outside of the Northeast. But if people know, email me at jeremy@uslhs.org. I would love to hear about them. So at this point, I was thinking maybe a good one to mention would be one that's used to be until pretty recently in officially within the Salem, Massachusetts, and the approach to the harbor there. It was the Bowditch Ledge Beacon. I've always pronounced it Bowditch, Bowditch, but I've heard people pronounce it Bowditch as well. So I'm not sure which is correct. But people may have heard of Captain Nathaniel Bowditch, who was a really important navigator and author of what's considered kind of a Bible of navigation, the New American Practical Navigator, published in 1802. He was really a genius. I was reading about his amazing life. He was as a kid, at the age of 15, he designed a barometer and a sundial, and he produced a very accurate navigational almanac at the age of 15, which is pretty amazing. And he was second mate on a ship by the time he was 21. He took an existing book, The Practical Navigator. He found a lot of errors in it, so he completely rewrote it and published it himself in 1802. And a lot of it is about celestial navigation, navigation by the moon and sun, and a lot of the techniques he described still work as well now as they did then. So it's a really important work. But the ledge beacon, the Bowditch Ledge Day Beacon, was not named for him. It was actually named for his great grandfather, who had a shipwreck there. Bowditch, the elder Bowditch's great grandfather, William Bowditch, was captain of many ships. He was the captain of the Essex galley in 1700 and went aground at what was then known as Tenapu Reef, a Native American name, and was then renamed Bowditch Ledge for him after that. I don't think it was a really disastrous wreck, but the ship did go aground there. And William Bowditch, by the way, was born in England in 1664. So the ledge was named for him. And eventually the stone marker was put on there to help mark the approach to Salem Harbor there. It's kind of near Great Misery Island. The islands around there are known as the Misery Islands, which is a great name because of all the shipwrecks there, and about a mile off the coast of Beverly. It's not far from Baker's Island Lighthouse, but I saw that beacon many times, the Bowditch Ledge Beacon, cruises around there. It was a very familiar sight. Again, anybody who has boated around Salem Sound there knows remembers the Bowditch Ledge Beacon, but sadly it toppled in a storm in November of 2018. It was pretty rough. I saw the stones kind of separating, and it looked endangered for quite a while, and then finally it fell over. There's no apparently the stones, the large granite blocks that was built over, were never. There was no mortar or anything. There was nothing holding them together. It was just a pile of stone blocks. So it's no wonder it fell over. But anyway, it's certainly there's just a pile of rocks there, which is somewhat of a hindrance to navigation. But some interesting history with that one.
Well, I'd like to talk about Fiddlers Ledge Monument. And that one is located, Jeremy, I know you're familiar with it, but that is located at the western entrance to the Fox Island Thoroughfare in Penobscot Bay. And for those folks who are aware of Browns Head Lighthouse, that is nearby Fiddler's Ledge. So that gives you some kind of idea geographically. But this is one of the older day beacons established in Maine, and it was established in the 1820s. But like a lot of these day beacons, even these granite ones, because they were not well built, if they took on a heavy sea, they would be destroyed and then, of course, have to be rebuilt. This particular one was actually destroyed in 1878 due to what they called sea and ice damage to it. So today, I know when we look out of Penobscot Bay, we won't see any ice out there, but back then there was ice in the bay, and when you had a sea and all that ice pounding up against it, of course, with structures not well built, they're going to topple over, and Fiddler's Ledge did topple over. So when the Lighthouse Service rebuilt it in the 1879-1880 time period, they increased its dimensions and built it up to a height of 35 feet, and it's been standing there ever since. Although when you look at it today, I can see a slight lean to it, and there's a couple granite blocks that are missing from it. But really, I know the local communities over there in North Haven and Vinyl Haven on the islands there, they love Fiddler's Ledge. They affectionately call it the monument. And people ask, how did it get its name? And that's always an interesting one. I don't think we can ever know the answer to a lot of these things. But there's two different stories of how Fiddler's Ledge got its name. And one of them was by author L. Whitney Elkins in the book called The Story of Maine, Coastal Maine. He says that quote, the people hereabout, so we have heard it averred, tell their children and credulous travelers that in old times a drunken captain ran his vessel on these rocks and fiddled merrily as the ship pounded against the ledge. And when she at length floated off immediately, she ran up to the drunkard and went down, end quote. Drunkard's Ledge is another day beacon we'll talk about. So in this case, they're talking about a captain who grounds on there and fiddles his way off till the high tide comes again and he can float off. But in the Cruising Guide to Maine by Don Johnson, he has a different version of it. He says, quote, the name for this ledge was probably supplied by one of many stone cutters from Ireland who worked in the nearby quarries during the mid-1800s. In Celtic lore, fiddlers are associated with fairies and sailors who die, particularly if they die at sea, are said to go to Fiddler's Green. Tripping your keel on Fiddler's Ledge could send you to Fiddler's Green, end quote.
Wow.
So I don't know how Fiddler's Ledge got its name, but there's two possibilities there. So I thought that was interesting. Interesting too, another thing with these day beacons, in the last 2 years, specifically the Coast Guard's making a more concerted effort to decommission some of these day beacons. Just they're not as needed for navigation, or not as deemed as needed for navigation as they once were. And Fiddler's Ledge and so many others are on that list as being advertised to be decommissioned. So though the Coast Guard does nothing with Fiddler's Ledge, the aid actually has been assigned to the cutter Tackle out of Rockland. So it is officially one of their aids. But like I said, the Coast Guard is now moving to advertise that they will be decommissioned as long as there's no pushback on that. So,
do you foresee anybody stepping in to preserve these structures? A structure like Fiddler's Ledge, which you mentioned is not in the greatest of shape at this point. Is that endangered, or do you think it's going to be saved by somebody?
Ooh, I hope it's saved by somebody. I mean, like anything, if the Coast Guard decommissions, it's going to be excess property. Do they do something with Fiddler's Ledge is similar to what they're doing with Little Mark Island day beacon? I don't know. And if that be the case, I think there will be an opportunity for any interested group, hopefully somebody local in the area who really does have an appreciation for a structure like that, to be able to care for that, because it's not just a day beacon. I think it becomes a part of anybody who fishes or transits that water. I know the windjammers that are through that water. It gives you a sense of place, and I think it's important that there's only a few surviving day beacons
Mhm.
of this type.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can carry them forward. I do hope it does have a pathway to preservation.
Yeah, they definitely have historic value. They're part of the historic seascape in a place like that. And again, Little Mark Island is currently going through the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act process, whereby it'll be awarded to a new steward. It's a little different because it has a light on top. It was built as a day beacon about 200 years ago, but it does have a light, a navigational light on top, although that has been discontinued by the Coast Guard. But I'm thinking that they kind of saw it as a lighthouse to put it through that process, whereas Fiddlers Ledge, being strictly a day beacon, probably won't go through that NHLPA process, I would guess.
You might be right. I don't know. I hope that there is a way, though, that they can transfer ownership, because that's what it's going to require, to be able to, that somebody can take it and care
Yeah,
for it.
maybe one of the historical societies in that area or something like that, I hope. You mentioned Drunkard's Ledge Beacon a few minutes ago. Do you want to add a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is one that historically was built in the 1874 time period. But I've had some personal experience of being on the spindle at Drunkard's Ledge for when I was working aboard the cutter Tackle from 2007 to 2010. There was a number of times that I was on there, and this structure had to be rebuilt during that period of time as well. But it's a really dangerous place. Right now, it is one of those day beacons the Coast Guard is trying to decommission, and the locals have enlisted Congresswoman Shelley Pingree to try to advocate on its behalf that it be rebuilt, because they deem it of value to at least the local marine traffic there. So, I mean, it's nice to see where locals really do value some of these day beacons and their purpose there. But when I look back on it, here's an interesting one. So the day beacon was established at Drunkard's Ledge in 1874. By 1876, Jeremy, the Bangor Daily Whig and Courier says that there was a petition put forth, and this petition was put forth to the superintendent of lighthouses at the time by mariners, and they were asking for the erection of one of what they call closes. I'm going to spell that CLOSE', closes tide fog bells. I never heard of such a thing, but they were asking for a fog bell, a tide fog bell, so obviously to be activated by the tide, to be placed on Drunkard's Ledge. And the reason was they said that 27 vessels had been wrecked at this point during the past few years, all which could have been avoided had there been a bell there.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an interesting story attached to Drunkard's Ledge. But a closes tide fog bell. I'm not familiar with that. And of course, there was a lot of wrecks on Drunkard's Ledge, because that's right in the approaches to the Fox Island Thoroughfare. And in terms of what this ledge does, it's because of the way the rock rises abruptly. Even on a calm day, the sea will just suddenly rise up and just roll over this. Even if the rock is submerged at high tide, and just roll over this area, it's quite riveting at times, especially if there's any sea rolling. It's horrible. During the wintertime, this gets so much sea against it, and it's why it's been destroyed time and time again. You'll just see all this ice form on it, and then the sea does crazy things to these spindles. It'll just bend them to the point where they're either bent over, and you would think, well, it's not, the diameter's not that. How does the sea do these things? It does. It's just amazing. But I quoted the author L. Whitney Elkins, The Story of Maine, a little bit earlier with Fiddlers. Got one little quote for him in regards to the drunkard, and he sort of I think expounds on what I'm saying. Quote, suddenly, right beside the steamer's course, the surf breaks and boils over a jagged ledge all awash with foam, and known far and near as the Drunkard. And as the foaming water momentarily recedes to the lower sea as if swallowed in one gulp, the newcomer cannot restrain the ejaculation. What an old drunkard he is, end quote. And he's not kidding in terms of how that water there just continues to rise up and just foam up and go past this ledge. So I know there was one day, it was very hard to get on these. You had to come in a skiff to get up onto Drunkard's Ledge, and you needed a calm day. So we were on it, and even on that day with the two of us trying to establish new day boards atop this beacon, you could feel as each wave went over this rock, you could feel the spindle just vibrate and shake a little bit and sway just ever so. And it was a disconcerting feeling. You just know that, and I'm thinking to myself, this is a calm day. Imagine this spindle taking the abuse of a heavy sea. And, in Penobscot Bay, we might, on a big storm, we might see seas, 9 to 16 feet, but it doesn't take much for that place to just go crazy. So it's hard for the Coast Guard. It has been historically hard. It remains hard to keep a day beacon at places like Drunkard's Ledge.
Yeah. Well, you're a braver man than me. I would never consider climbing a thing like that. So at this point, I just thought I'd mention one more that I've done some research on over the years in Massachusetts. It's people know it as Ben Butler's Toothpick. Officially, it's the Black Rock Beacon, but it's a day beacon, I should say, that's located on Salisbury Beach on the northern Massachusetts coast, near the mouth of the Merrimack River, right on the mouth of the Merrimack River, across from Plum Island Lighthouse, which is in Newburyport. There used to be a range light station on Salisbury Beach there. That's long gone. No lighthouses, but smaller, like post lights, a set of range lights with a keeper's house. There was a keeper there. But Ben Butler's Toothpick, or Black Rock Beacon, dates back to 1873 or 1878, depending on which source you believe, but let's say the 1870s. And it's quite familiar. It's a red slatted pyramidal day beacon on top of a wooden base. I'm not wooden, I mean stone base, a granite base built of granite blocks. And again, quite familiar around there. You can see it if you go to Plum Island Lighthouse and look across the water. You can spot it. And it's named for General Benjamin Franklin Butler, who was quite a character. He was, among other things, a congressman in Massachusetts. He was governor of Massachusetts for a while after several failed tries. He was elected governor in 1882. He was, as I said, a congressman for a while, and he was an avid sailor. He lived in Newburyport for a while in his life. He was also, by the way, a general in the Civil War, but he was kicked out of the army for his poor military ability. So again, he had quite a career, quite a life. In the Civil War too, he got the nickname Beast Butler because for a while he was put in charge of New Orleans during the Civil War, and he was such a horrible governor for that area. They called him Beast Butler. But he, as a sailor, he was interested in helping navigation in that area in the mouth of the Merrimack. And so he had a lot to do with the appropriation for getting that marker built. Just one more thing I should add about his life. I made him sound like he was a horrible person, but he also advocated for fair treatment of workers, like in the mills. He was from Lowell, Massachusetts originally, which is known for its textile mills. And it was largely because of him that they went from having 14-hour workdays for these workers, including young girls in the mills. He fought and accomplished the establishment of a 10-hour workday instead of the 14-hour workdays. So you got to give him some credit for that. But anyway, so he had this marker built circa 1870s. Now it's just on the beach, Salisbury Beach. It's on the state beach at Salisbury. Near there is a part of the beach that's kind of a old amusement park and resort area. But the marker is on the official state reservation there. And if you walk down the beach, it's a nice walk on the beach to see Ben Butler's Toothpick. But in this case, it's an interesting looking structure. But I think in this case, the story is the life of the man it was named for, which was quite interesting.
I think the last day beacon I'll mention was Shag Rock Day Beacon, which was located just northwest of Owl's Head Light. And that was established in the 1874 time period and, of course, was rebuilt. It was one of these pyramidal wooden structures. So they were slatted. So you had the wood poles that would make a pyramid, and then about halfway up, they would slat it, and they were usually painted white to make it conspicuous. One of the cool things about this was when it was rebuilt, like I said, a few times, but it was destroyed in the 80s, late 80s. And at that time, the Coast Guard, I know you mentioned a story where the Coast Guard spent a lot of money to restore a day beacon. They actually rebuilt this Shag Rock Day Beacon to its historic specs. and flew the structure out by helicopter from Owl's Head Airport, and then had a crew on the rock there to fasten this structure to the ledge, which was no easy task. And really, because they couldn't insert the wooden legs into the ledge, they actually used almost like an L bracket, but a much heavier type of L bracket on each leg to secure it to the ledge. And those brackets held, and the structure is about 50 feet tall. It was very impressive. They didn't look very tall, but I know one year we painted that tower, I think it was like 2009, and we had to have a ladder just to get up to the slatted area, and you could put three of us, one over the other. This was a very tall structure. And but in a storm in January of 2022, it finally fell over, and the storm waves really just washed the superstructure for the most part into the bay, and onto some of it had landed onto shore, then it was floated ashore. Mm-hmm. And this is another one now that the Coast Guard has announced that they are decommissioning. They will not rebuild. So the era of Shag Rock Day Beacon, which lasted from 1874 to through 2021, beginning of 22, is now over. So it's sad. I used to be able to look out the keeper's house and always see that tripod, as we'd call it, standing there. And so that little sense of place has now been relegated to history. But still, these day beacons, I think they don't get enough credit for what they did well, and that was they marked spots that could not be marked otherwise. Mm-hmm. They were the sites of shipwrecks. They were the sites of occasional deaths, and they were very helpful to the local communities, and even to those steamers and ships that were not familiar with the area. But I think we're seeing the end of the day beacon come, as far as its value as an aid to navigation, but it had quite a history.
Nice summing up there. I hope some of them can be saved as historic landmarks or sea marks.
Oh, me
regardless
too.
of their importance to navigation these days. So with that, I think we can kind of wind things down here. Thank you so much, Bob, for this discussion. It's a lot of fun, and you wouldn't think that these day beacons would be such an interesting topic of discussion, but they certainly are. They all have their own story to tell, just like lighthouses.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're welcome, Jeremy. I think you said it. They have a story to tell. Some of that story is based on those shipwrecks and loss of life. Some of it's legend and lore. I think it's all important, and I think it adds a bit of spice, good in a good way, to our love of lighthouses, because we can actually expand our love of lighthouses and find out that the same types of stories, that like wreck and loss of life, unfortunate loss of life, but just how it protected. Lighthouses did all that, saw all that. Well, day beacons saw a lot of that same type of things. And for those who are looking for something new to actually dig into historically, that relates to lighthouses, I think day beacons would be a fascinating place to start.
Yeah. You going to write a book on day beacons?
Maybe one day.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. Seems like a good idea.
There is a story on the Society website that I wrote about day beacons, the anonymous lifesavers. That is something that is available on the Lighthouse Society website. So,
okay. And if people have trouble finding that, just go to the search box on the front page, uslhs.org.
The title of the article is Day Beacons, the Anonymous Lifesavers of the Sea. And that was in the Keeper's Log, Volume 25, Number 2 of 2009.
It's on the website.
If you see the pictures of the different types of day beacons and the bird cages and the pendants, and, I mean, that's a resource people can go on for the Society website and find. And
it's got pictures of some of the structures we've talked about and some other ones as well, including one at Palm Rocks in Rhode Island, right near the lighthouse there on the Providence River, which we haven't touched on. So that's another pretty prominent and very old one as well.
That Palm beacon, I always find a chuckle, because some of the locals have referred to it as the milk jug. So these day beacons can come up with some interesting nicknames.
Yeah, I don't see it looking like a milk jug exactly, but I guess so, if you have an imagination. Anyway, we should wind things down here. So I want to remind everybody again, to visit uslhs.org, not only to see Bob's article on day beacons, but to check out everything the U.S. Lighthouse Society offers, including tours, preservation grants, the passport program, and so on. And also, I want to remind people, if you listen through Apple Podcasts, please rate and review us. So any final words about day beacons or anything else, Bob?
No, I think just thank you for expanding the topics of aids and navigation to day beacons. I think it's very appropriate. They save lives.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'd love to include things that are not lighthouses exactly, but have somewhat of a relationship to them. So thank you again. And to all our regular listeners and our new ones, as always, thanks so much for listening, and
keep a good light.
Shine all in my house. I'm gonna let it shine all in my house. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.